Today's video may contain some disturbing subject matter, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. And if you have a true scary story you would like to send my way, just go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so. And of course, thank you. I have a strange and creepy thing that happened to me a while back. And honestly, it's something that I genuinely cannot explain. I used to be a driver for a rideshare service that's pretty well known. And because of that, I was out on the road for a lot of the afternoon and evening. I would typically do the job until around 10 p.m. at night, and then head home from there, and go to bed to wake up to do my day job. It was a rough schedule to follow, and I was losing a lot of sleep because of it, but it is what it is. This whole thing took place in mid-April, and we were getting hit with some pretty intense spring storms. Where I live, we get the major rain and thunderstorms through April, to the point of getting tornadoes. But money is money, and I was at the point where I needed to get paid. Plus, rainstorms meant that there was a chance of more clients, because people don't want to walk out in the rain. I was out, taking the riders to where they needed to go, and I had finished what I planned to be my last ride, and I was heading back to the gas station. I then saw a young man walking on the side of the road, soaking wet. Part of me said that he was fine, but the other part of me thought that I should ask him if he was okay, at the very least, because I would want people to do that for me. I pulled over, careful not to splash him as I stopped, and rolled down the window asking if he needed a ride. At first he seemed a bit standoffish and hesitant, but after a few moments he nodded and thanked me, then walked around and got into the passenger seat. I asked him where he needed to go, and he asked me if I could take him to the Walmart that was in town. I lived over in that direction, so I was more than willing to do so. I mentioned that I could get him there, and mentioned that I did have to stop at the gas station though, because I was about to be on E. He said that was fine, and that he could use something to drink anyways. We headed off, and the whole time we were driving, he just kind of stared at the road, not saying anything. I didn't want to push him into any small talk if he wasn't comfortable. I just mentioned the storm and said it was pretty crazy, and he nodded with a slight smile. The whole ride, this guy looked like he was really upset. Like he wanted to cry but was holding it back, which was why I really didn't want to push him into chatting. We pulled up to the gas station, and I parked at the pump, and he just kind of stood around for a moment while I filled my tank. I then asked if he was going to go inside to get his drink, and he mentioned that he didn't have his wallet, that he'd left it behind. I could tell that this kid was going through a tough time, so I told him that I would buy his drink if he wanted it, and again, he seemed a bit standoffish. I said that it was fine, and that I would be happy to do so long as he paid it forward and helped someone else out in need in the future. He nodded and again thanked me. We walked into the gas station, the guy at the counter greeted us, and as soon as we got in, the guy said that he was going to use the restroom really quick. I said okay, and I watched him walk toward the back where the restrooms were. I then went over and got my soda, and then waited near the counter. After a few minutes, the clerk kind of looked at me and asked if I needed help with anything, and I said that I was just waiting for the guy that came in with me. He gave me a very confused stare. I mentioned that the guy I came in with had gone to the restroom, and then said that I was just giving him a ride to the Walmart. He then said, "You didn't come in with anyone, sir." I described the guy in detail, and mentioned that when we walked in, he went straight to the restroom. The clerk said that that was impossible, because the restrooms were locked after 9 p.m. And in order to use them, you had to get the key, and he still had the key. He then pulled the key out from under the desk, attached to a little keychain animal thing, and said that in order to get into the restroom, he would have had to have used that key. I was a bit confused. I watched the kid go into the restroom. Or at least I thought I did. I watched him go to the door and reach for it, and then went to get my soda, which was by the front counter. The restroom was in front of me the whole time until I was standing there by the counter, waiting for the guy to come out, at which point I was near the hall where it was. I asked if I could go check on him in the restroom, because I was certain that he was in there, and the clerk said that that was fine. He handed me the key, and I went to the restroom. I knocked, and when I got no answer, I unlocked it. It was completely empty, and it looked like it hadn't been used for a few hours. I looked back at the hallway, and there was no exit there. It was just the one door to the restroom and the closet where all the soda syrup pumps were. There was literally nowhere to go in this area. He was nowhere to be seen. At no point could he have exited this hallway with the restroom without me seeing him. There was no exit, hole, window, or method that he could have gotten out of the building. I walked up and just kind of stared at the clerk like, what the hell? He returned my very confused look and asked if I was okay. I kind of mumbled that I must have been losing my mind and just paid for my soda, thanking the clerk for his time and help. I walked out to my car and sat there in the driver's seat and just pondered what the hell this hall was. There was no way for him to have gotten out of that station without me seeing him, outside of him somehow climbing through the ceiling. Which, yeah, I don't think that happened. The clerk said that he didn't see me walk in with anyone, which makes me think that this kid never existed. But he got in my car, and I spoke to him, and I drove him to the gas station. I honestly have no idea what to make of this event, and it's one of those things that seriously messed with me for this last year. I swear that this kid existed. I swear he got in my car and walked into the station. But everything else seems to point at him never having existed. Was this some kind of spirit? Did I give a ride to a ghost or some kind of paranormal anomaly? I have no clue, and I honestly don't think I'm ever going to know. I've been a fan of your content for quite some time, and I thought that it was a good time to go ahead and finally share an event that happened to me several years ago. Hopefully it can be a good lesson to others, and I know that I didn't handle the situation the best, and one lesson I learned from this was that sometimes it's best to just keep your mouth shut. Some people out there have ill intentions, and it's best to remember that and avoid situations where you can act on them, if possible. Anyways, on to the story. Back in the spring of 2012, I had taken a quarter off from school in order to kind of find myself, which sounds sort of dumb, but I was newly 19 and struggling to really decide what I wanted to do with myself as far as careers go. I had completed a couple of quarters of college already, but it was all core classes. And I was feeling the stress of having to figure everything out, so I decided to just take a couple of months to myself. During this time, I had also decided that I should look into part-time work, so that I had some extra money as I didn't want to fully depend on my parents. I'm not saying that I didn't appreciate them, I just didn't want to be a burden. I ended up landing the night shift at a local convenience store, which was really just a small gas station that sold pizza. It was a decent job, it paid okay, but I think the biggest benefit was, in fact, the pizza. The only part that I struggled getting accustomed to was the fact that I had to work until midnight. And working that shift meant that I was the one that had to go do the thorough cleaning. I'm not much of a night owl, which may sound a bit contradictory to the fact that I took this job, but I was young, and, like I said, still trying to figure stuff out. One night, in the middle of May, which would have been about 2 weeks into me working there, I was manning the front of the store by myself while my other coworker did the stocking. We had already finished up the store cleaning, which meant that, for me, it was pretty smooth sailing for the last half hour of the shift. At one point, this muscular-looking guy comes in and stares at me really intently as he enters the store. It was one of those if looks could kill moments. I had never met this guy, never seen him before in my life, and I had no idea why he seemed to have a problem with me. As he walked by, I asked him if I could help him. Not even in a snarky way, in a sincere customer service way. He stopped walking, stared at me, and just slowly shook his head while clenching his jaw, and then walked past me without a word. I was a bit confused, but I just thought that maybe this guy was in a really bad mood, and my asking him that was too far. I ignored it and went back to sitting there doing what I was doing. After about 5 or so minutes, this guy walks back up to the counter with a soda and a bag of chips. He goes to drop them on the counter, and I go to grab them. But before I could, he opens his mouth and says, "Get your coworker to ring me up." I stared at him for a moment, just like, "My man, what?" He repeated his demands. I relented and stepped down to shout for my coworker Dylan. When he asked what was up, I told him that I needed him up front. He came up, I mentioned that he needed to ring up the customer, and he made a comment about how I was on the register. I then mentioned that this guy specifically requested that I get somebody else to ring him up, and though I could see that he was frustrated, he shrugged and went to ring this guy up. The whole time he was ringing him up, this dude was giving me the side eye. His jaw was still clenched, and his fist was balled up, like he really wanted to attack me. I stood off to the side, just past the counter, sort of awkwardly waiting for this to finish so that I could go back to doing my job, and Dylan could go back to stalking. Dylan finished ringing him up, took his money, and then wrapped up the transaction. As he turned to walk away, I told him to have a good night, which, yes, it was a bit of a jerk thing for me to do. This guy clearly was not happy with me for whatever reason, and I should have just kept my mouth shut. When I said this, the man stopped dead in his tracks and turned back towards me. I lifted my hands and said, "My apologies." But this guy started walking in my direction and stopped with his face right at mine. At this point, I realized that I had really made a mistake by being such a smartass, and how much larger this guy was than me was way more obvious when we were on level ground and he was right in my face. He grabbed my shirt with his free hand and pretty much lifted me off the ground slightly, which, again, made me realize that this man could probably crush me. He then stared me straight in the eyes and aggressively said, "I swear to God, Jeremy, if I ever see you again, I will break every bone in your puny little body. Got it?" I just sort of nodded like I understood what he was saying, and as soon as I did, he shoved me, hard, into one of the racks. Hard enough that, when I hit it, it fell over and I went with it. Then he turned and just walked out of the store, got in his car and left. All the while I was lying on the floor staring at the lights, wondering who the hell Jeremy was. My name is Adam. It's always been Adam. I have always gone by Adam, and I don't know anyone named Jeremy, nor have I seen this man before. There's no way that I could have done something to warrant this aggression. Dylan came over to help me up and basically had the same thought that I did, and he asked me who Jeremy was. I told him that I honestly had no idea, and explained that I didn't know that man, that I had never met him nor seen him before. We both kind of went back and forth about how confusing this was, and by the end of it, we agreed that there must be some guy out there named Jeremy that looked just like me, and he did something to make that man very mad. We got the store all cleaned up and got the rack back up, and I wrote a note to the boss to explain what had happened, just in case he watched the tapes and saw the whole thing play out and had questions. In the end, I came out of this encounter mostly unscathed, and I never saw this guy again while I worked there, which was, admittedly, only for the duration of that spring quarter. I will say that about a month after I quit, Dylan texted me to tell me that he ran into the guy once after I left, and he seemed completely normal, which then tells me that I was definitely the cause of his distress. I'm glad that he never had to act on his threat, and to Jeremy, whoever you are, I want you to know that you owe me one, and that you should be a bit more careful about who you piss off. I have a story that honestly sounds like a bit of an urban legend, but it actually happened to me back whenever I had moved to the small town that I used to live in back in the spring of 2003. I don't want to give out my exact location, but I will say that I lived in a small town in the southern part of the Midwest, in a town that was definitely more rural than urban. It was a nice little community, and I chose to move there because the company I worked for was expanding into the neighboring city, which was only about a 20-minute drive. I wanted to be close to my new home office, but I kind of wanted to avoid actually living in the city itself, so I compromised and moved into the small town on the outskirts. Like I mentioned, it was nice, and for the most part it was just the people who lived there, a general store, the church, and a few other small businesses. As is the case with most small towns, there were a few warnings to those that were new, specifically to avoid certain places outside of the town to the west, which is where the whole urban legends thing comes into play. Nothing screams campfire story like being told to avoid two places: the old mines and the forest that had grown over it. I actually asked someone why I should avoid the forest, and if it was because the land was unstable from the mine. And they told me that there were things that were far worse in the woods than unstable ground. Again, I know this literally sounds like a horror movie because that's what I was thinking the entire time. I had just moved there, I was being warned of things in the woods, and people were being ominous about everything involved. This was literally the plot to a scary movie that I swear I saw back in the early 90s. And much like those movies, I was going to go ahead and just treat these warnings as noise. I wasn't much of a rebel. I just wasn't going to let some nonsense pull me away from the walking trails out in the unincorporated parts of the hiking areas. When I moved to the town, I told myself that, on the weekends, I was going to make more time to become in tune with nature, and that I was going to take my dog, Maddie, hiking out in the woods so that she could get used to it as well. About a month into living there, I finally decided that it was time to put my plan into action. It was a bright and beautiful springtime Saturday. It was warm, the sun was out early, and the air was just perfect. When I got up, I knew right then and there that this would be the day that I took Maddie out onto the trails for a nice hike, and that it would be the start of a new hobby for us. I got dressed for it, got Maddie all sorted out, got a backpack full of water and food just in case, as well as whatever essentials I thought we would need, and I was beyond ready to go. We drove out to the walking paths and parked in the lot near the park. I took a while to study the map that was posted and look at how the trail curved, made a note of how things were situated in my head, in case I got lost and had to use a compass to get back. Being 2003, I didn't have a smartphone or GPS on me to get back anywhere. And then, after a good amount of debating, I went ahead with the plan and started out into the woods. Now, my plan had me going on the walking trail that would circle back from the west, around the south, and then reconnect at the east. However, at the furthest south part of the trail, you could keep going and could hit that spot of land that people had warned me about. I, of course, was going to check this area out. If for no other reason, I was going to prove that it was all just a bunch of bologna. Maddie and I got out onto the trails, walked around, and after a while I decided that I was at the right spot and started to head off the trail towards where the area was that I was told to not go. At first, it wasn't that bad. It was just a thicker area of the trees with no real distinct markings. But after a while, it started to get a bit strange. As I pressed on, I noticed that there were spots where the trees seemed to just be dead, completely lifeless. Which isn't necessarily too out there, but it was weird to see random trees that were just completely void of leaves in the middle of this lush forest. As I moved south, the dead trees seemed to become more abundant, until I hit a circle of them that was completely brown and decrepit. At this point, Maddie started whimpering and pushing against my leg, as if she was trying to let me know that something was wrong. At this point, my courage turned to genuine curiosity. Something was really strange here, and I kind of wanted to go a bit deeper to see what I could see. I pressed into the dead zone until I got into an area where it was more open. This circle of dead trees wasn't huge. It was just dense and obvious. And in the middle, there was a clearing that was decent sized that seemed to have been cut out. As I entered into the clearing, the air seemingly grew colder, and it hit a level of silence that was painful. I could hear my heartbeat, my breathing, and the soft whimpering that Maddie was holding back. I stood there in the clearing looking around and trying to piece together what exactly it was, when I noticed that the air felt, I guess, stale is the word I want to use, and it had a smell to it that was just empty. I tried to walk further into the center of the opening, but Maddie was refusing to move, which was incredibly unlike her. She was an adventurous dog, and usually did not disobey me if I tried to pull her in a direction, and to see her like this made me hit that point that I was second-guessing my actions. If she was this scared, then something was going on. I decided that it was time to go ahead and go back, that I'd spent enough time investigating this mystery. As I turned to walk back the way I came, the silence was broken by what sounded like a stringed instrument, like a violin. I know that sounds really weird, but as I was walking away, I started to hear something that sounded like somebody playing a single, out-of-tune, and constant note on a violin. That was my absolute breaking point. My slow pace doubled, and I pulled on Maddie's leash and told her to come. We started with the fast walk, but moved into a jog to get back to the trail, which we did, thankfully. When we got back to the trail, everything seemed to be back to normal. It was warmer, the air was moving, and life had returned to the forest. I stopped to catch my breath, take a big drink of water, and tell myself that I would literally never go back that way again. After a few moments, I got back to my walk. We still had half the trail to go before we could get to the car. I felt fine. A little freaked out over what we saw, as it was definitely unnatural, but Maddie, on the other hand, was kind of freaking me out. Every few minutes or so, she would pause and look back in the direction of where we were. And each time, she would let out a whimper and try to pull me to keep me going. She did this for the rest of the walk back to the car, like she was waiting for something to follow us, or like she thought there was something there in the distance. Thankfully, she stopped doing this after we got home, and she hasn't had that level of paranoia since then. We also haven't gone back on that trail since that day, because I didn't want to get too close to it all. The whole feeling was unnerving and terrifying, but I think I was actually feeling a bit more scared with how Maddie was acting on the rest of the hike. I feel like she felt something was following us, like she knew it was there and she was keeping a close eye on it the rest of that hike. Part of me wonders if something did try to follow me out of there, but just didn't, for some reason. I don't know. Obviously, I wasn't the only one to have dealt with this, considering people had warned me, which just makes me more curious as to what exactly it was. Some kind of break between our world and the supernatural? Some kind of demonic ground? I have no idea. I no longer live in that town, and unfortunately, Maddie did pass away a couple of years ago. But the memories of that hike, the feeling I got when I found that clearing, and the way that she reacted, that sound that I heard, and just everything about it, those memories have never left me, and they probably never will. I have always been more of a lurker than someone who is active in groups like this, but I finally come to a point where I thought that sharing the experience that happened to me a few years ago was a good idea. Honestly, this whole thing haunts me still to this day, and I've never been able to come up with anything rational to explain any of it. And I understand that it may not be too exciting to some, but to me, it was terrifying. I figured sharing my story here would be a good idea since a lot of you seem to have a lot of insight to offer. So, if anyone has an explanation for me, please, do share. A bit of background. I live in the north, where spring storms are pretty common. You know, the kind with really heavy rain, explosive thunder, raging lightning, and the occasional random tornado that will fly through and rip everything apart. As terrifying as they can truly be, I've always found these storms to be both thrilling and eerie. But I never really thought that I would have an experience of something genuinely terrifying during one of them. The story takes place on one of those very stormy spring evenings. I was home alone. My parents had gone out to visit some friends a bit before the storm started, and because of how bad it was getting out there, it was unlikely that they would be home anytime soon. They'd left me with a short list of chores to do around the house, which, while annoying, was good enough to keep me occupied, since I wasn't going to be able to go outside. I was 16 at the time, so being home alone wasn't a big deal, even during storms. As the evening progressed, the storm got even worse. The wind was blowing like crazy, rain and hail were smacking the siding, thunder was shaking the glass each time it hit, and it was nearly pitch black out at 6:30. To put it lightly, it was a really intense storm. I was doing the dishes, finishing up my chore list with an episode of SpongeBob playing in the other room for noise. The lights flickered, and the TV actually shut off. The old TV had this really annoying feature or something that would cause it to completely power down if the lights flickered like that. I don't know if it was to protect it from a surge or something, but it happened any time we got a strong storm like this. Annoyed, I rinsed off the plate I was washing, turned off the sink, and went to dry my hands so I could go turn the TV back on. As I walked into the living room, I went to reach for the remote when I realized how silent and creepy the room was, despite the storm. And I think I noticed this because the silence was broken by what sounded like a whispering sound. I stopped for a second, trying to see if I could pinpoint where exactly it was coming from, but when I actually tried to listen to it, it was gone. I shrugged it off, thinking it was probably just something to do with how the wind was catching the house, and decided that I would leave the TV off while I went back to finishing the dishes. When I started washing the dishes again, I heard another voice, but this time, it was above a whisper. It was very soft, but it was at least audible, and I swear I heard it say, "I'm scared." I remember when I heard it, I jumped, and I turned around thinking there was going to be someone standing behind me, but there was nobody. I looked down the hallway, checked the front door, looked out the front window, and again, there was nobody. Then, I looked out the back window and nearly needed a change of pants. Out in the backyard, standing by the back corner where there were a few trees, I saw what looked like a little girl. I squinted to make sure that I wasn't just seeing things, but my assumption was 100% confirmed when she lifted her hand and waved at me, and then walked back towards the trees at the back fence. I had two thoughts go through my mind immediately. One was, where the hell are her parents and how did she get in my yard? And the other was, she's going to die if she stays out in this storm. Then I started thinking about what I should do. Should I call the cops? Should I go out and try to help her? I ultimately ended up choosing the second option, grabbing my rain poncho, which, with how bad the storm was, did nothing, and grabbed a flashlight and started out into the backyard. I walked out and was immediately pelted by cold rain and hard winds, to the point that I was almost blown over. I kept on into the yard and started shouting for the little girl, but didn't get a response. When I got to the tree line in the back, I turned on the flashlight and looked around, but she was nowhere to be seen. I kept shouting hello, looking around to see if she had just run off, but it was as if she had never existed. There was no way that a girl her size could have climbed that fence either. She looked like she was about 4 or 5, and we had a wooden privacy fence around the entire yard. Which, again, made me question how she could have ever gotten into the yard in the first place. I looked around only for a couple of moments. The rain was getting to be a bit too much for me, and when I was basically satisfied that I was crazy and that she wasn't there, I went back to the house. I stopped on the back deck, standing there, drenched and confused, just trying to piece together whether or not I had seen the girl, or if I had been hallucinating. Almost as if on cue, I hear the voice again saying, "It'll be okay." But this time, it was coming from behind me, which was the house. I immediately said nope and went back inside, shutting and locking the door behind me. I dried off, turned on every single light, and went back to watching SpongeBob at a volume that was way too loud. I just sat there completely ignoring every other sound that I heard from the storm, or the house creaking, and focused on the show. When my parents got home, they asked me why I was still awake, and when I tried to explain the whole thing, they laughed and said that I was probably just seeing things. I laughed and said, yep, and then went straight to bed. I have no earthly idea what exactly this all was. Part of me is screaming that it was paranormal, as the girl didn't seem to really exist. But I don't think that it was a black-eyed kid, as she wasn't at the door or begging to come in or anything. She was just there. I need to do some more research on them, though, because I don't know enough about them to confidently say that it wasn't. But that's my story. Does anyone here have any thoughts? Was this just a spirit out in the storm? Or was this something potentially much more malicious? Ah, yes. Springtime. The sun warming up the planet. The grass growing into this beautiful green, luscious color. The flowers blooming with all of their might. The birds chirping. The squirrels eating the peanuts that I put outside for them, because they enjoy them. Oh, and also people seeming to not exist. Yeah, why were there 2 stories today that had people that didn't exist? That terrifies the hell out of me. So there you go. That was today's video. A collection of scary spring stories. Stories that all happen in the springtime. Spring is apparently as creepy as autumn. Because, yeah. Good stories. Good scary stories. Thank you to everyone who let me use their stories, or those on Reddit who let me use their stories, or those who submit the stories to me, as I was trying to say there. Without you all, I wouldn't have the content to put out like this, so again, thank you. And thank you for listening to this point if you got to this point. I hope you enjoyed these stories, because I did. And if you did enjoy them, please consider hitting that thumbs up button. If you are new to the channel and liked what you heard and want more content like this, consider subscribing, as I do this up to 3 times a week. At least 3 times a week. Not up to. Whatever. Anyways, you can also go down below, leave me a comment if you're feeling so bold. Do you like the springtime? What are your thoughts on the springtime? Do you live in a place that gets these nasty spring storms like I do? Don't get me wrong, I love the spring storms, I really do. But whenever you look outside and there's hail covering the ground like snow, it gets kind of terrifying. You start thinking about how much damage it's done to your car already. At least that's what I was thinking. Anyways, you can also join my Patreon or memberships for get early access to content like this if you want to. Never, ever expected, always, always appreciated. And yeah. Anyways, friends, I hope you're having a beautiful week so far. I hope I do see you again soon, but until then, remember you are loved. You're valid. You're important. You're the best you that you can be. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. Never, ever forget it. And until next time, my friend, much love and sleep well.